Thank you all so much for joining this call. We thought that it would be fantastic to spend time with you to just talk about how we could flatten the curve for those of you who are leading the charge as educators as we're trying to navigate COVID-19. So today, my colleague and thought partner, Dr. Ian Roberts, who's worked all over the nation, specifically in Baltimore City, in New York City, in LA, and also here in the Midwest in St. Louis, and has recently joined Lively Paradox full-time to just help leaders and educators alike make their way through the challenges that we typically face. And we thought it'd be helpful to just help you restore your own personal sanity as you're trying to lead others. So Dr. Roberts, with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Price, and thank you all for being here. So, recently I know we are under strict travel advisory. We're not able to travel as frequently as we are used to, but because of my prior work commitments, I have had to just brave, if you may, the travel schedule. So I've got my mask and my gloves and done some flying. Over the last couple of weeks, I took advantage actually of the very spacious emergency row exit. And what is interesting about this slide, and I wanted to share this experience, is we all know that as we sit in this emergency row exit, one of the things that is often asked of us or by the flight attendants is whether or not we are willing, capable, and able to actually provide assistance as needed in cases of emergency, in case of a crisis, in case of a disaster. And they actually encourage us to look them in the eye and give them a verbal yes. And I've done that on many occasions in the last 3 weeks. And indulge my analogy because over the last several years, for some of us decades, you've been asked to whether or not over and over again, you are committing yourself or yourselves to actually meet the needs of every single student, every adult who knock on the doors of your classrooms and of your schools. And we have said yes. More importantly, during this crisis that is unprecedented, that yes means so much more now to us than it did before, where we really have to be supportive of every person in whom we are in charge. About a decade ago, Nicole and I, we did some work with a research question. I led the charge in this, and we asked the research question as to whether or not we can actually use empathy and compassion to move schools and to move the needles with regards to organizations. And what we landed on were 7 key strategies. And so the first strategy that we landed on was the one around celebration. And so today, I want us to kick off our time together with celebration, and I'll ask Nicole to pose the questions around celebration as we think about our time during COVID-19.
So in the chat, if you have capability, if you could just share with everyone who's on the call, what are 2 things that are going well, are that for you personally, or that are going well in your district or school during this COVID-19 situation? We want to get a sense for what are some things that people are doing that are working. Lots of folks are sharing every day, lots of the things that aren't working. So we wanted to get a sense from you, 1 or 2 things that are working really well in your districts. So take a moment to type that, and I'll share a few of them out, and they'll be helpful to us as we continue to provide support. I'll give you just a few seconds there to give folks time to type. Tamika's saying that her middle school has maintained normalcy by creating a virtual schedule for students and having daily Zoom meetings with students. Richter Craig is saying 2 things that are going well. They had 98% attendance rate during the 3 weeks of distance learning. That's fantastic. Dr. Marjorie Williams is saying that continuing to identify equity issues in schools. Some of my non-education clients are absolutely trying to figure out how to prioritize equity and issues of diversity and inclusion during this time. And so I love it that you all are focused on behaving as if equity is a critical component of doing well here. Communication with families is improving. Challenges around student family needs are also being considered. That's fantastic. Providing professional development for teachers who are uncomfortable with virtual classroom technology to help with student engagement. I love it. Those are great. Thank you for sharing, and feel free to, throughout the time that we're here together, we're only going to take about 15 minutes of your time, and we're going to spend the remainder of the time answering questions that you might have that are specific to your challenges. But please share the things that are going well, and then also in chat type questions. I'll be monitoring the chat as Dr. Roberts is continuing.
Absolutely. Thank you. And so prior to you all starting to share, what I alluded to was we asked this research question about a decade ago, and the question was, if we lead schools with empathy and compassion, will it result in unprecedented gains for student achievement as well as improvement of teacher performance? And of course, we came up with a null and an alternative hypothesis. We rejected the null hypothesis, and we found that it was in the affirmative. And so the 7 key school leadership questions that we came up that we have shared with districts across the country and school leaders, and they've used many of these all together or some separately, and they have proven to be effective are: 1, engage in the community; 2, it's important to lead with empathy and compassion, especially during times of crises; 3, to have what we call the DOPE, and we always have to make sure that we spell this out, and that it means daily operational plan of excellence, so people do not misinterpret what it is. You always must have non-negotiables as a school leader, as a district leader, or as an educator. Coaching is critical because we commit to building capacity in those who are not where we want them to be. Celebration, we always start our meetings with celebrations, and we always find time to celebrate in the midst of challenges and a crisis. And first and foremost, all this listed as number 7, we always ground the work that we're doing in the mission and vision of the school, the district, or the organization. Today, we plan to spend the next 10 minutes or so remaining during the time that I'll do most of the talking, focused on one of the 7 key strategies. And Nicole and I both discussed and agree that now more than ever, during this pandemic, during COVID-19, finding ways to thought partner with you all, finding ways to provide you with some strategies just from our work around how to effectively engage the community, I think will be incredibly helpful for those of us on the call and those of us who are doing the work. And we believe that as you think about finding ways to connect with all stakeholders in a manner that enables them to feel seen, heard, and supported is the most effective way in which you can engage the community. When we think of the work that we've done in districts over the years, too many educators tend to go into communities with an approach of, we're here to do something to you and for you, as opposed to doing something with you and alongside you. And anchoring your work by engaging community in the latter approach, where you want to partner with, you want to work alongside, and where you're grounding this engagement in a symbiotic relationship that is characterized more by mutualism instead of parasitism, has always been effective. You want to make sure that those stakeholders, both internal and external, are seen, heard, as well as they're feeling supported.
And what we want to make sure that we're doing for you consistently is making sure that you feel seen and you feel heard and you feel supported. We recognize that in order for you to be able to show up for school leaders and educators in this way, that someone has to be doing that for you.
Absolutely. And before I jump into the 2 different types of communities that we've considered, let me offer and build on what Nicole just shared. As school leaders, as district leaders, as individuals in positions of leadership, now more than ever in this unprecedented time, those individuals that you are leading are going to increase their trust of you. They're going to expect so much more from you. And you'll find yourself in places, as I have, where you're fielding more phone calls that you have fielded in the past 5 years, where you're having more virtual meetings that you've had in the past 5 years, and you're essentially just pouring out, and then the question has to be asked, who or what is pouring into you? Is anyone pouring into you?
And so as we focus on this one of the 7 key strategies, engaging the community, we wanted you to know that we're going to go through all 7 of them in depth over the course of the next week, but we wanted to go deep on this one today. But if you can keep a lens towards how you do this for yourself and for others as you're engaging with us, that would be really helpful. So when we think about who is the community, hopefully you've had an opportunity to read some of the internal stakeholders. But one obvious difference between education and some of the folks that I work with in industry is, in industry, the organization tends to always understand that we can't skip the employees to take care of the customers. We have to take care of the customers as well as think about take care of our employees as well as think about the customer, because it is the employees who are going to take care of the customers. Education is one of the only industries in which sometimes leaders forget to think about themselves as well as the educators and staff in the building and how they're going to support kiddos. And so when we're thinking about the internal community, include yourself in that number because it's important to think about yourselves as well. The external community includes parents, obviously, but also faith-based communities, politicians, industry leaders and businesses, but also your community partners. So what would it look like if we thought differently about how food banks and homeless shelters can support us during this time? What are some of the unusual suspects? So who are the youth in our communities who are influential when we're inside of 4 walls, and how can we use them now? You will need to, for your organizations or for your position inside your organization, to think about your external and internal partners and try to list them all out. Get them all out on paper or in a document so that you're making sure that you're not forgetting anyone.
Absolutely. And to build on that, Nicole, I think one that comes up for me that falls within both internal and external communities, especially during this time, are our students. Having looked at a number of my colleagues across the country as they tap into the homeless population in their districts, their schools and school districts with homeless population, student homeless population that are as high as 30%. And it just brings up the question, how are we in an equitable way, grounded in our work in equity, engaging students who are homeless, who do not have access to the same resources that other students have? So when we think of engaging the community, both internal and external, our students fall squarely into that.
And then so once you identify who the community is, now we have a 5-step process for thinking through how do you engage all of those partners. So the first step would be, as I said, identifying the various communities, internal and external. And sometimes our affluent school districts forget about the fact that sometimes kiddos go unattended when their parents are wealthy as well. And so try not to let your own biases get in the way as you're identifying or going through this next step, which is identifying the needs of each group and the support that they might need.
Absolutely. Additionally, again, understanding what are the barriers? What are the barriers to access to those students? And one that we know that is also common is access to technology. One school district that has made the news recently, and there are several across the country, School District of Philadelphia, the superintendent made the bold and courageous decision to say, we're not going to have virtual learning. The reason why, because having looked at the data of his district, came to realization that I think more than 20% of students will not have access to technology. So essentially, by the end of this pandemic, what would have resulted was a significant widening of the curve between students of privilege, because in this case, it's a privilege to have access to technology, and those who are not. One other quick point before we move on to the next slide is we've started thinking about some writing around the COVID slide. So we often speak about summer slide, right, over that 2-month period. And having looked at the MAP assessment and a growth norm assessment, we know that about 20 percentage points of summer loss results in English, language arts, and about 27% in math. And that's only over a 2-month period of time. We know that a number of our students are not effectively engaged for at least 4 months. And so if you double that amount, this is just food for thought. What would be the curved slide impact on students, especially those with special needs, English language learners, and students who really need to be effectively engaged in our schools?
And also, as we think about understanding some of those barriers, just, wealth doesn't necessarily help as it relates to safety at home. And so what we've understood is that reporting for abuse has gone down. And so how can we name the benefits of engaging all of our stakeholder groups to make sure that we are developing strategies to support everyone who needs. So all 5 of these steps are ways to make sure that we engage each of those communities. We thought it would be helpful today to go through a specific example of engaging one stakeholder group. And so we're just going to walk through really quickly here what it would look like to use that same process if we were talking specifically about school leaders.
Absolutely.
So we identified school leaders, and the second step would be identify the needs of each school leader in your district. So Doc?
Yeah, so school leaders is so critical right now during this pandemic. And it's not that we are sort of underestimating or not giving the same level of importance to any other role amongst our cadre of educators. But when you think of those of us who are leading school leaders, who are supporting school leaders, using this example, you want to identify the needs of each school leader. And this is not an exhaustive list. But one key challenge that school leaders are facing right now is the necessity for them to be able to keep teachers and staff engaged, even as those teachers, staff, related service providers are trying to connect with students to make sure that there's continuity around pedagogy and learning. School leaders have to think about ways, more creative now than ever, to inspire adults in their buildings, right? Sometimes as school leaders, we struggle to inspire 100% of adults in our buildings when we're making contact with them, when we're seeing them every single day. We exhaust every attempt. So it becomes even more challenging now for us to be creative, to engage and inspire those adults in the buildings, because we want to focus on retention. How do we inspire teachers and other adults in the building to maintain positive contact with students without becoming too sort of overly committed to students, without taking advantage of the time, without spending too much time connecting with them via the phone? We have a number of districts that have social media sort of policies where students should not make contact with adults. This is a time where we have to be a little bit more relaxed on that. How do we maintain positive contact with parents, right? Even those parents that with whom we've not necessarily have the most collegial relationships. And I know I'm not the only school leader that have had the parent who did not necessarily see eye to eye with me. But during this time, how do we make sure that we are putting the needs of students and the needs of parents at the forefront of our minds and reaching out to them? And finally, how do we really mitigate the risk associated with COVID-19, the impact on teaching and learning outcomes? As I alluded to earlier, not wanting to be a pessimist, but I'm certainly thinking about ways to mitigate the COVID slide that is likely to happen because of the 20 percentage points or more and 27 percentage points or more loss in summer in learning. What are the benefits of engaging this group of leaders, right? So we continue to use a school leader as an example. One, there's a necessity for them to be able to keep teachers and staff engaged while they're educating students. Because if they're not, then we have to think about how will we be able to retain them? What number of our teachers and adults right now are at home and they're not necessarily in a place where they can be committed to providing virtual learning? How many of them have to navigate being teachers while they're being a stay-at-home mom or dad, while they're also being a stay-at-home pet mom or dad, when under different circumstances, they would either have their own children in school, they're gonna have a pet sitter, the dogs will be locked up. I just heard Nicole's dogs barking in the background. How do we make sure that we are engaging our teachers, understanding that they too have challenges at home? How do we inspire our other service providers who we're not engaging with regularly, or related service providers, or police officers, or school security officers? Do we have the time to continue to engage them, to remind them that they're equally as important in this work? Maintaining positive contact with students. So our teachers are maintaining positive contact with students. What efforts are we making right now to make sure that as school leaders, as principal supervisors, that we're also maintaining positive contact with students and with parents? Understanding the barriers to such access. And yes, we alluded to the fact that one of the key barriers, especially with regards to students, is access to technology. The same barrier applies to a lot of our adults. The virtual environment, are all of our adults equipped with the right technology? What about access to high-speed internet, right? Are we going to blame them, or do we want to make sure that we're committing ourselves to being even more empathetic right now when we realize that everyone cannot be on at the same time? So the virtual technology access is something that I know school leaders are struggling with because they're not able to effectively, some of them, engage with all of the adults in their buildings while they're at home. Just various levels of comfort with operating virtual platforms, right? By the time COVID-19 is over, many of us will become experts with Zoom, but by the time it's over, some of us will become so fatigued with Zoom that we do not want to see another Zoom meeting. But in the meanwhile, those individuals who are not as comfortable with virtual platforms, how are school leaders going to find opportunities to provide some offline training? Home and work environment, we shared earlier about children being in a home. I've heard from a number of school leaders who are either taking care not only of their own children, but of other family members and relatives, and hopping onto Zoom or some other virtual platform for 2 hours a day, 5 days a week, is creating added stress to them as individuals. And finally, what about the physical health? We've seen across the country where, unfortunately, COVID-19 has also impacted a number of educators, right? Either with illness or even, unfortunately, in death. And are we creating spaces where we understand that individuals are going to get sick, they're going to become ill, and as a school leader, how do you navigate that? So now that we've shared that sort of who are those individuals, who are the school leaders that you need to sort of be able to provide support to, what are some of the benefits of supporting those leaders? What are some possible barriers of supporting them? Let's think about a couple of strategies that we can use. And some of them we're offering, and this is certainly not an exhaustive list, is to over-index on celebration, right? More than ever before, continuously celebrate your team whenever you get on a virtual platform, and do the same thing with students. Celebrate, celebrate, celebrate. Coaching, especially in terms of communication, risk management, and how do you assist your teachers and staff to manage their own current situations and challenges that they're dealing with during COVID-19.
And if I might add, when we say coaching, we're not talking about performance coaching in this particular moment. We're talking more about the fact that people have specific areas where they're stuck that we've never seen before. And so our next session is going to be, what does it look like to do coaching in a way that helps people to get unstuck, and less around performance coaching.
And this idea of over-indexing as well, and empathy and compassion, now more than ever, we all have to build our empathetic muscles. Because remember, we're not just focused on academic outcomes and learning outcomes, but we have to be focused on how do we make sure that we're mitigating the anxiety and at-home challenges that a lot of our adults are dealing with. Our daily communication has to shift, whether it's newsletters, emails, or a short video. Make sure that your daily communication is grounded in and anchored around lots of celebration and lots of support.
And then when you think about resources, we again want to make sure that you're thinking about how you're going to be, even if we're just looking at school leaders and they are people that you support, then what does it look like for you to make sure that you have all of these same things supporting you? So these were the 5 steps if we were to pick school leaders as our stakeholder group that we wanted to work through. We would say that you would do that for every single one of your stakeholder groups after you've identified them. And so what we'd love to hear now is, feel free to unmute yourself, but we'd like to hear, what are your specific questions or challenges as it relates to either your own personal anxiety or engagement, or how you might engage the community. So we've got a comment here that says, I believe this will be essential to prepare for the new normal after the stay home social distancing orders are lifted. They're
Nicole,
certain.
sorry, can we name who those questions are coming from? Would be helpful so people can reach out as well if they need to.
Well, everyone can see the comments in the chat, but
Got it.
this is from Jamila.
Got it. Thank you.
I'd love to hear from Loretta. You said only 10% of your students didn't have the technology. What actions is your district taking, or the districts you're working with taking, for that remaining 10%?
They've had contact, the teachers and counselors are FSLs, those are the school liaisons, have all made contact with the parents, and some parents, and it's actually 10% of my school,
Okay.
have made contact, and some parents just, you know, don't want to pick them up. They don't want to do the work.
Gotcha.
Right. It's kind of sad, but it's 10%.
Yeah. Which is significant. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Ian, we don't have any additional questions in the chat. I do want to let you know that if you need specific targeted help, feel free to schedule a 20-minute call with us. We are giving out our free culturally responsive coaching sessions during the pandemic. It might sound like we're being overly generous, but in all honesty, we're doing it to help maintain our own sanity. And we think all of you have to do that for yourselves as well. But we are, that's how we're staying engaged and doing our part to help make sure everybody's getting through this. And our next session is going to, again, be on culturally responsive coaching. So thank you so much. I appreciate the time that you all have spent here today.
Thank you all. Look forward to connecting with you again soon. We will stick around just for any questions that anyone, if you may have additional questions, I'll stick around for a few minutes.
Yeah, Richter says thanks for the information. He's headed to a PD with his staff. Dr. Marr just said, although we know disparities have long existed, the current situation focuses on areas that can no longer be hidden. That's absolutely true, and that I think we need to take advantage of that for sure. Anna Stubblefield just says thank you, and Jamila says thank you. Thank you all for joining. We appreciate you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.